Morning seldom announced itself with great ceremony above the waters of old Boston Harbor. It arrived quietly, almost reverently, as though mindful that countless generations had awakened before these same gentle tides without leaving more than the faintest impression upon the stones beneath their feet. The first light rested upon the still water long before it reached the narrow streets, and for a few peaceful moments the harbor appeared to belong only to the seabirds gliding across its calm surface and the anchored vessels waiting with patient confidence for another day's turning tide. Many who looked upon those tranquil waters believed they were witnessing only another ordinary sunrise. Time alone revealed that ordinary mornings often preserve the richest history. Welcome to the American Gazetteer. Tonight we turn the pages of history back to Suffolk County, Massachusetts, where quiet harbor waters reflected not merely ships and steeples, but the steady rhythm of everyday lives lived without expectation of remembrance. If you found comfort in these unhurried journeys through forgotten American counties, consider subscribing, for each new entry sought to preserve another peaceful corner of 19th century America before it faded completely from memory. Here, the harbor was not merely a boundary between land and sea. It was the county's faithful companion. Before the ringing of church bells echoed across the town, before merchants unlocked heavy timber doors, before the smoke of breakfast fires drifted from brick chimneys into the cool morning air, the tide had already begun its silent labor. It lifted fishing craft with gentle certainty, nudged ferries toward their landings, rocked distant merchant brigs against stout wooden piers, and carried with equal calm both humble fishermen and prosperous traders toward another unremarkable day. In Suffolk County, the harbor did not interrupt life. It quietly measured it. From the higher ground of Beacon Hill, the roofs of Boston descended toward a forest of masts gathered beside the waterfront. Stone churches lifted graceful spires above crowded streets, while long wharfs stretched confidently into deep water, remaining among the busiest commercial landings inherited from the previous century and continuing to welcome vessels from near and distant shores. Even as the 19th century unfolded and the shoreline slowly changed through careful filling and construction, the harbor remained the county's enduring heart. Its tides touching nearly every occupation and household. The harbor awakened every sense without ever raising its voice. A cool breeze wandered inland, carrying the mingled fragrance of salt water, fresh timber, tarred rope, and distant wood smoke. Horse hooves struck the uneven stones with a measured cadence, while the slow creak of wagon wheels blended with the gentle murmur of waves beneath the wharves. Somewhere beyond the crowded rooftops, a church bell announced the hour, not with urgency, but with familiar certainty, its sound drifting across the water until it softened among anchored vessels, waiting for the favorable tide. The county's days seldom began in haste. Rather, they unfolded with the quiet confidence of customs repeated through generations. The streets nearest the waterfront were already receiving their earliest visitors. Sailors stepped ashore carrying sea chests worn smooth by long voyages. Porters balanced crates upon broad shoulders, their careful footsteps echoing beneath warehouse walls built of enduring brick and granite. Shopkeepers swept yesterday's dust from their thresholds before opening heavy shutters to the growing daylight. Children carrying small baskets hurried beside parents toward morning markets, while apprentices unlocked workshops where the scent of fresh-cut oak, iron filings, leather, and linseed oil would soon fill the air. None imagined themselves remarkable, yet together they composed the peaceful rhythm by which Suffolk County quietly revealed its character. Beyond the busy wharves, quieter neighborhoods greeted the morning with equal gentleness. Narrow lanes climbed gradually toward Beacon Hill, where modest brick homes stood shoulder to shoulder behind wrought iron railings and carefully tended gardens. Window curtains stirred as fresh air entered parlors lined with well-read books, polished tables, family Bibles, and carefully folded correspondence tied with fading ribbons. Breakfast tables gathered several generations beneath a single roof, and before the day's occupations scattered them across the town, many households paused together in prayer. Such moments seldom appeared within official records, yet they formed the quiet foundation upon which the county's history rested. Not every resident earned a livelihood upon the sea, though nearly every household felt its influence. Schoolmasters opened classroom doors while the harbor bells still echoed across the rooftops. Printers arranged fresh type beneath tall windows where the morning light proved most generous. Blacksmiths coaxed glowing iron beneath rhythmic hammers, their workshops filling with sparks that briefly rivaled the rising sun. Bakers carried warm loaves toward nearby markets, their ovens lending comforting warmth to streets still touched by the cool breath of the harbor. Everywhere, ordinary labor unfolded with patient dignity, as though each craft contributed another careful stitch to the county's enduring fabric. Across the water, Charlestown greeted the same morning beneath a somewhat different silence. The broad slope rising from the harbor carried modest dwellings, workshops, rope walks, and shipyards whose labor had long been shaped by timber, wind, and tide. Here the ringing of an anvil often mingled with the cry of gulls wheeling overhead, while long lengths of hemp stretched beneath the roofs of rope walks, where skilled hands patiently twisted cordage, destined for merchant vessels and fishing schooners alike. The fragrance of fresh pine mingled with oak shavings, and seasoned shipwrights examined each beam with a practiced eye, knowing that strength at sea often depended upon quiet care given long before a vessel ever touched the water. Between Boston and Charlestown, the ferries crossed with reassuring regularity. They were humble craft, seldom celebrated in printed histories, yet they quietly united neighborhoods, families, tradesmen, apprentices, ministers, and travelers whose lives depended upon those familiar passages. Gentle waves lapped against weathered landing steps as passengers waited with baskets of produce, folded letters, parcels wrapped in brown paper, or simply the intention of spending another ordinary day across the harbor. Conversations remained unhurried. Faces became familiar over seasons and years. The ferryman often required no introduction, for he knew his regular passengers almost as well as he knew the changing currents beneath his oars. It was within such unnoticed crossings that Suffolk County revealed one of its finest qualities, not grandeur, but quiet continuity. As the sun climbed higher, the marketplaces gradually filled without surrendering their gentle order. Stalls displayed baskets of apples gathered from nearby orchards, root vegetables still carrying traces of the earth from surrounding farms, fresh fish brought ashore with the morning tide, carefully churned butter, wheels of cheese, bundles of herbs, and bolts of homespun cloth awaiting patient buyers. Housewives paused to exchange familiar greetings. Children lingered beside barrels of fragrant apples, and farmers from neighboring communities guided their wagons carefully through streets already alive with measured activity. No voice sought to rise above another. The market possessed its own quiet music, the rustle of paper wrapping, the creak of wooden wheels, the steady footsteps of horses upon worn cobblestones, and above them all, the distant breathing of the harbor that never seemed entirely absent from the life of the county. The afternoon seldom hurried the people of Suffolk County. Even when business occupied every corner of the waterfront, there remained a quiet order that seemed to belong as much to the harbor as to those who labored beside it. Sunlight settled warmly upon the granite warehouses of Long Wharf, their weathered walls bearing the marks of many seasons, while narrow shadows stretched beneath stacked barrels, timber crates, coils of rope, and carefully balanced casks awaiting their next voyage. Teamsters guided patient horses between the wharves and counting houses, their wheels leaving familiar tracks upon the uneven streets, polished smooth by decades of steady passage. Above the gentle industry, white gulls drifted almost effortlessly upon the sea breeze, as though keeping silent watch over a harbor that had long learned to measure prosperity without abandoning its tranquility. Beyond the bustle of the harbor, another Suffolk County revealed itself with every measured footstep. Those who wandered inland discovered streets where commerce yielded gently to domestic life, and where the enduring character of the county was written not upon ships' manifests, but upon brick walls, polished door knockers, weathered meeting houses, and the quiet customs of neighbors who had greeted one another across generations. The air carried less of salt and tar here, though the harbor was never truly absent. A fresh breeze still found its way through the narrow lanes, carrying with it the distant cry of seabirds and the faint ringing of ship's bells that reminded every resident how closely the town remained bound to its waters. Families opened their shutters to welcome the afternoon light into rooms furnished with sturdy tables, high-backed chairs, carefully tended hearths, shelves of treasured books, and clocks whose measured ticking quietly governed the household. Mothers attended their daily duties, while children practiced careful handwriting upon slates beneath the watchful guidance of older siblings or tutors. Grandparents often occupied the warmest corner near the window, reading well-worn sermons, newspapers, or cherished family letters whose folded pages preserved voices from journeys made years before. Such homes rarely appeared in grand paintings or official records, yet within their modest walls, the true inheritance of Suffolk County quietly passed from one generation to the next. The churches of Suffolk County stood not merely as places of worship, but as familiar landmarks by which many residents quietly measured the passing of their lives. Their steeples rose above rows of chimneys and rooftops, visible from winding streets and from vessels entering the harbor alike. On ordinary weekdays, their doors remained open to the weary traveler, the merchant seeking a moment of reflection, or the widow who found comfort within familiar pews, polished smooth by generations before her. Sunlight entered through tall windows, settling softly upon worn hymnals, carved galleries, and simple wooden pulpits, whose voices had witnessed baptisms, marriages, solemn farewells, and seasons of thanksgiving without ever seeking distinction for themselves. When the Sabbath arrived, the county assumed an even gentler character. The steady movement of wagons diminished, shop shutters remained closed, and families, dressed in their finest garments, walked quietly toward meeting houses whose bells floated across the harbor on the cool morning air. Children held tightly to gloved hands, while older generations greeted neighbors whose families they had known for decades. Ministers spoke with measured dignity, yet it was often the silence between familiar hymns that lingered longest in memory. Leaving the church, congregations dispersed slowly beneath broad skies, exchanging news of harvests, apprenticeships, births, illnesses, and voyages, preserving the invisible threads that quietly united every corner of the community. Education occupied an equally respected place within the county's daily rhythm. Small schoolrooms welcomed boys and girls beneath simple timber ceilings where sunlight filtered through broad windows onto rows of sturdy desks marked by years of careful study. Slates, copybooks, well-thumbed primers, and neatly trimmed quill pens rested upon polished wood, awaiting another lesson. Outside, the distant sound of carriage wheels occasionally interrupted the quiet recitation of geography, scripture, or arithmetic before fading once more into the streets. Teachers encouraged not only learning, but patience, discipline, and thoughtful conduct, believing these qualities would serve their pupils long after particular lessons had been forgotten. The schoolhouse, like the church and the family hearth, quietly sustained the enduring character of Suffolk County from one generation to the next. The printed page possessed a quiet authority throughout Suffolk County. Along streets where printers' workshops stood beside booksellers' windows, the measured rhythm of the hand press became as familiar to many residents as the ringing of church bells or the creaking of ships at their moorings. Inside these modest establishments, compositors patiently arranged countless pieces of metal type, one letter after another, beneath the steady glow of tall windows. Sheets of damp paper hung neatly upon drying lines, while freshly bound volumes waited beside newspapers, carrying reports from neighboring towns, distant ports, legislative halls, and the wider Atlantic world. Yet among these publications, county notices, family announcements, sermons, almanacs, and local advertisements often received the most careful attention, for they spoke directly to the lives unfolding just beyond the workshop door. Books seldom rested idle within thoughtful households. Evening light from the hearth fell softly upon family Bibles whose margins carried the names of children, marriages, and departed relatives in careful handwriting preserved across generations. Collections of sermons, histories, poetry, practical guides for farming or navigation, and well-worn gazetteers occupied simple wooden shelves, their leather bindings growing smoother with every passing year. During winter evenings, when wind wandered through the narrow streets and snow settled quietly upon rooftops overlooking the harbor, families gathered together while one voice read aloud and the others listened in thoughtful silence. Such peaceful hours left few traces within official records, yet they shaped the memory of home more deeply than many celebrated public events. The courthouse square possessed a quieter dignity than the busy harbor, yet it too reflected the steady pulse of Suffolk County. Men and women arrived not only to settle legal matters, but to exchange greetings, collect notices, read newly posted announcements, or await acquaintances whose business had drawn them into the town. Attorneys carrying neatly folded papers passed clerks whose desks overflowed with ledgers, deeds, wills, and carefully copied records that would one day become the fragile threads from which descendants sought to understand their own beginnings. The scratching of quill pens, the turning of heavy pages, and the measured footsteps echoing across stone floors composed a music every bit as characteristic of the county as the whispering tide beyond the wharves. By the middle years of the 19th century, the harbor continued to unite every corner of Suffolk County with a quiet constancy that no roadway could entirely replace. Each morning began with familiar crossings as ferries departed their slips, their broad wooden hulls bearing merchants, laborers, school children, ministers, craftsmen, and visiting relatives from one shore to another. The ferryman required little conversation, for the faces before him had become companions through countless passages. Wrapped in shawls against the cool sea air, or standing patiently beside baskets, parcels, and market goods, the passengers watched the shoreline drift slowly across the water, while the rhythmic splash of oars and the gentle creak of timbers accompanied another ordinary journey. To many residents, these daily crossings seemed so commonplace that they scarcely deserved notice, yet they quietly bound together the neighborhoods, occupations, and families that gave the county its enduring character. The shoreline revealed a different character with every changing tide. At low water, weathered pilings emerged from the harbor like quiet guardians whose surfaces had been polished by countless seasons of wind and salt. Fishermen inspected their small boats before pushing gently away from the land, while boys searched among the exposed stones for shells carried inland by the receding sea. Elderly residents often paused upon the wharves, resting beside coils of rope and timber posts, watching familiar vessels arrive with a patience acquired through long years. They seldom hurried home. The harbor itself provided sufficient company, offering new reflections with every passing cloud and every shifting current. Not every journey across the water ended upon the bustling streets of Boston. Noddle's Island possessed a quieter rhythm, where cultivated fields, grazing livestock, orchards, and scattered farmhouses still occupied much of the landscape during the earlier decades of the 19th century. The crossing from the crowded waterfront required only a short voyage, yet the change in atmosphere seemed far greater than the distance itself. Here the wind carried the fragrance of newly turned earth rather than warehouse timber, and the sound of grazing cattle often replaced the constant murmur of commerce. Farm families tended stone walls, modest barns, kitchen gardens, and fruit trees whose blossoms brightened the spring air, supplying nearby markets while preserving a rural character within sight of one of America's busiest harbors. Beyond the island's fields, narrow country lanes wound gently between stone fences that had been patiently assembled one fieldstone at a time. Chickens wandered freely about barnyards, while horses grazed in quiet pastures beneath the watchful shade of ancient elms. Smoke rose lazily from farmhouse chimneys, where bread baked within brick ovens and kettles simmered above steady hearth fires. Families labored together through every season, pruning orchards in early spring, gathering hay beneath the warmth of summer skies, harvesting apples in autumn, and repairing tools beside glowing lanterns during the long winter evenings. Though the harbor remained visible across the water, life here moved according to the slower calendar of the land, preserving another equally important face of Suffolk County. As evening drew gently across the harbor, the light changed with a quiet grace that generations of Suffolk County residents had known almost instinctively. The bright reflections of midday softened into long ribbons of amber that drifted across the tide, touching the hulls of anchored schooners, the weathered timbers of Long Wharf, and the granite faces of warehouses that had watched countless sunsets in silent succession. Fishermen returned with modest catches, ferrymen completed their final crossings, and shopkeepers lowered heavy wooden shutters one by one. The measured sounds of the day gradually surrendered to gentler companions, the distant ringing of a church bell, the rustle of wind through rigging, the creak of mooring lines, and the steady murmur of water meeting the pilings beneath the docks. It was during these peaceful hours that the harbor seemed less a place of commerce than a faithful keeper of memory, reflecting the lives of ordinary people with the same quiet constancy it reflected the fading sky. Families gathered once more beneath their own roofs as lamps were lit behind tall windows overlooking narrow streets and quiet courtyards. The aroma of simple suppers drifted into the evening air, while children recounted the small adventures of their day before sleep gradually overtook them. Older generations unfolded well-worn letters, read a few pages from familiar books, or sat together beside glowing hearths where conversation required no urgency. Outside, watchmen continued their patient rounds, their footsteps echoing softly upon cobblestones, polished by decades of use. Across the harbor, lanterns aboard anchored vessels shimmered upon the darkening tide like scattered stars, while the silhouette of Beacon Hill rested peacefully against the last light of the western sky. Nothing within the county sought to astonish the eye. Instead, Suffolk County offered something quieter and perhaps more enduring, the gentle assurance that home could be found wherever familiar bells, steady tides, and welcoming windows greeted another day's end. The first stars seldom appeared alone above Suffolk County. One by one, they emerged over the quiet harbor until their faint reflections mingled with the wavering lanterns suspended from anchored vessels. Night watchmen moved unhurriedly along the waterfront carrying hooded lamps whose modest circles of light slipped across granite blocks, timber wharves, and neatly coiled ropes left ready for another tide. A sailor paused beside the rail of his brig to study the familiar outline of the town before retiring below deck, while somewhere beyond the warehouses the measured tolling of a bell marked another passing hour. Even in darkness, the harbor continued its patient conversation with the shore, its gentle waters rising and falling against weathered pilings, exactly as they had for generations before, and exactly as they would for generations yet to come. With the turning of the seasons, Suffolk County revealed that its character belonged not only to its streets and harbor, but also to the quiet procession of the year itself. Spring arrived almost imperceptibly, carried inland upon cool salt breezes that softened the lingering chill of winter. Along the common, fresh grass gradually emerged beneath ancient elms, while gardens beside brick homes awakened with carefully tended flowers, whose colors brightened the narrow streets. Fruit trees blossomed upon Noddle's Island, and in neighboring cultivated lands, their pale branches stirring gently beneath skies increasingly filled with returning swallows. Boat builders welcomed the milder weather with renewed industry. Farmers prepared their fields for another season of labor, and merchants looked toward the harbor with quiet anticipation as more sails appeared upon the widening horizon. The county did not celebrate the arrival of spring with great ceremony. It simply breathed a little more deeply, as though the entire landscape had remembered an old and comforting promise. Summer brought longer days, whose generous light lingered over the harbor well into the evening. The first warmth of dawn often found fishermen already beyond the nearest islands, their modest boats gliding across water so calm that every mast and cloud seemed faithfully reflected beneath them. Along the wharves, coopers shaped sturdy barrels with practiced blows of wooden mallets. Caulkers sealed the seams of waiting vessels, and sailmakers stitched broad lengths of canvas that fluttered softly whenever a sea breeze wandered through the open lofts. Their work seldom drew the attention of visitors, yet without these patient craftsmen, the commerce of the harbor could not have continued. Every hammer upon timber, every needle through heavy sailcloth, and every measured turn of a cooper's adze became another quiet contribution to the life of the county. By midday, the streets nearest the waterfront filled with the familiar procession of carts, hand-barrows, and wagons delivering flour, molasses, timber, cordage, and carefully packed goods from the countryside. Market women shaded their baskets beneath wide bonnets, while apprentices hurried between counting houses carrying folded correspondence sealed with wax. From open windows came the scent of fresh bread, drying herbs, and newly planed pine, mingling with the ever-present fragrance of salt carried inland by the harbor breeze. Even beneath the brightest summer sun, Suffolk County never seemed hurried. Each trade followed its accustomed rhythm, each household its familiar routine, as though the county understood that steady labor accomplished more than restless haste ever could. As autumn quietly approached, the quality of light changed once again. The mornings arrived, wrapped in gentle mist that drifted across the harbor before slowly lifting from the rooftops and church spires. Orchard keepers gathered ripened apples into sturdy baskets destined for nearby markets, while wagons laden with pumpkins, turnips, onions, and late-season vegetables rolled carefully over familiar roads toward the town. Children delighted in gathering fallen leaves beneath the great elms of the common, their laughter softened by the crisp air, while household gardens yielded their final herbs before winter's first frost. Chimneys once again released thin columns of fragrant wood smoke that rose peacefully into clear blue skies, reminding every resident that another season of preparation had quietly begun. Throughout these changing months, The harbor remained the county's faithful companion. Its tides neither hurried nor delayed themselves for the concerns of men. They continued their ancient rhythm beneath autumn skies, just as they had beneath the warmth of summer, carrying fishing boats, ferries, and merchant vessels with equal patience. Generations came and departed along those same waters, yet the harbor preserved their memory in quieter ways within the worn stones of its wharves, the polished handrails of ferries, the weathered timbers of shipyards, and the countless footsteps that had crossed its waterfront without imagining they would one day become part of history itself. As autumn yielded at last to winter, a remarkable stillness settled over Suffolk County without diminishing its quiet industry. Snow gathered gently upon the roofs of brick houses, softened the outlines of churchyards, and rested along the timbers of Long Wharf until even the busiest waterfront seemed wrapped in contemplation. The harbor itself rarely surrendered entirely to ice, for the tides continued their patient motion beneath the pale winter sky, carrying dark ribbons of open water between anchored vessels. Sailors drew heavy cloaks more closely about their shoulders. Teamsters guided their horses carefully across frost-hardened streets, and smoke from countless hearths drifted upward into the calm air before dissolving among low gray clouds. The season demanded greater endurance, yet it also revealed the quiet resilience of a community accustomed to meeting each change with steady resolve rather than complaint. Within homes, winter evenings lengthened into peaceful gatherings, illuminated by candlelight and the warm glow of well-tended fireplaces. Grandmothers mended garments beside baskets of wool. Fathers repaired tools that would again serve them when spring returned. And children listened as older voices recalled family stories whose beginnings reached farther back than anyone living could remember. Outside, the wind occasionally stirred the bare branches overlooking the common, while distant church bells floated through the cold evening with unusual clarity, their familiar notes crossing rooftops before fading across the harbor. These gentle hours rarely found their way into newspapers or official ledgers, yet they preserved the spirit of Suffolk County more faithfully than many celebrated public occasions. For it was around the family hearth that memory itself quietly took root. The winter nights seemed especially suited to quiet reflection, when the streets had emptied and only the occasional lantern marked the passing of a watchman. The county rested beneath a silence broken only by the soft murmur of the harbor and the distant creaking of ships riding gently at their moorings. Windows glowed like scattered beacons along the narrow lanes, revealing families gathered around polished tables where letters were answered, journals were kept, and cherished books were read aloud before the fire. Somewhere a violin offered a simple melody. Elsewhere, the turning of a page became the only sound within a comfortable room. Such evenings reminded every household that contentment was seldom found in grandeur, but rather in familiar voices, steady occupations, and the quiet assurance that tomorrow would begin much as yesterday had ended. Long before the first shop bell announced another working day, small workshops throughout Suffolk County had already begun their patient labors. The harbor depended not only upon great merchant vessels, but upon the countless craftsmen whose names seldom appeared in newspapers or public speeches. Wheelwrights shaped stout spokes from seasoned oak. Cabinet makers guided finely honed planes across fragrant pine and mahogany. Tinsmiths worked beside glowing charcoal fires. And coopers fitted staves together so precisely that each finished barrel could withstand long voyages across uncertain seas. Their workshops were modest, yet every shaving that curled from a plane, every measured strike of a mallet, and every carefully sharpened tool quietly strengthened the life of the county. The blacksmith's forge possessed a character entirely its own. Even before sunrise, a faint orange glow escaped through the open doorway, illuminating the cobbled street with gentle warmth, while the cool morning air still lingered above the harbor. Inside, bellows breathed steadily into the fire, awakening bright embers that danced beneath bars of iron waiting to be shaped. Horses stood patiently while worn shoes were replaced. Wagon axles received careful repairs. Hinges were fashioned for household doors. And countless tools essential to daily labor passed beneath the smith's experienced hammer. Sparks rose like brief constellations before fading into the dim rafters, yet nothing within the workshop suggested haste. Every measured blow reflected years of patient skill handed quietly from master to apprentice. Nearby, the cooper's yard echoed with an altogether different rhythm. Long rows of oak staves leaned against weathered walls, drying beneath the changing seasons until they were ready to become barrels destined for flour, salted fish, molasses, cider, or imported goods arriving through Boston Harbor. Apprentices carefully heated iron hoops before fitting them around each cask, while seasoned craftsmen inspected every joint with practiced attention, knowing that even the smallest imperfection might reveal itself only after many days at sea. The scent of fresh-cut oak mingled with the fragrance of pine shavings drifting from neighboring workshops, reminding every passerby that the prosperity of the waterfront depended as much upon these quiet yards as upon the ships anchored beyond the wharves. Not far away, cabinet makers transformed carefully seasoned timber into furnishings that would remain within Suffolk County homes for generations. Broad workbenches held polished planes, chisels, braces, and finely sharpened saws, arranged with almost ceremonial order. Sunlight entering through tall workshop windows revealed delicate curls of maple, cherry, and mahogany gathering beneath steady hands. Dining tables, high-backed chairs, writing desks, cradles, and tall case clocks gradually emerged from rough boards through patience rather than speed. Many pieces were commissioned for newly established households, while others marked weddings, inheritances, or the quiet prosperity earned through years of honest labor. Their makers seldom carved their own names prominently into the finished work, content that the quality of the craftsmanship would speak long after their voices had fallen silent. Throughout these workshops, apprentices learned more than the use of tools. They observed the habits of careful workmanship, respectful conversation, punctuality, and quiet perseverance that shaped the character of both the craftsman and the community. The older masters rarely hurried instruction, understanding that skill acquired slowly often endured longest. During brief pauses in labor, stories were exchanged of difficult winters, memorable voyages, changing seasons upon the harbor, and families whose fathers and grandfathers had stood at the very same benches. Thus, the county preserved its traditions not through grand monuments alone, but through ordinary conversations carried gently above the steady rhythm of honest work. As daylight slowly declined, the workshops one by one surrendered their labors to the quiet of evening. Plane irons were carefully returned to their places. Forge fires were allowed to settle into glowing embers, and the last curls of wood were swept from well-worn floors. Craftsmen paused at their doorways before turning toward home, often exchanging a few unhurried words with neighbors whose own day's work had reached its natural conclusion. Along the streets, shop signs moved gently in the harbor breeze, while the final wagons rolled toward nearby stables, their iron-rimmed wheels sounding softly upon familiar cobblestones. Above every ordinary task lingered the quiet satisfaction of useful labor honestly completed, a reward understood without proclamation by nearly every household throughout the county. When evening lamps began appearing behind rows of windows, Suffolk County seemed to breathe more slowly. Families gathered around simple suppers where conversation seldom concerned distant affairs before it returned once more to familiar subjects: the condition of a horse, the success of a young apprentice, a letter expected from relatives at sea, the approaching Sabbath, or the promise of another harvest. Outside, the harbor reflected the first lanterns of anchored vessels as gently as it had reflected the morning sun, preserving in its calm waters both the beginning and the close of another ordinary day. It was this faithful repetition, rather than any single remarkable event, that quietly shaped the county's enduring identity through the 19th century. The harbor resumed its quiet vigil as the last household lamps dimmed one by one. A late breeze stirred the rigging of vessels lying at anchor, and the faint creak of timbers answered the slow breathing of the tide. Along the wharves, a watchman paused beside stacked casks and coiled rope, lifting his lamp just enough to trace the edges of familiar forms before continuing his measured round. From distant quarters came the softened echo of a bell marking the hour, its tone drifting across water and stone until it faded into the night. Such hours asked little of those who kept them, yet they preserved the gentle continuity upon which the county had long depended. With the return of morning, Suffolk County once again revealed that its quiet industry extended beyond trade and craftsmanship into the steady cultivation of knowledge. Within modest schoolrooms and more established academies, young minds were guided with patience rather than urgency. Tall windows admitted the gentle light of day, illuminating rows of desks where pupils practiced their letters, recited passages, and traced careful figures upon slates. The sound of instruction was seldom raised above a measured tone, for teachers believed that understanding, like the tide itself, advanced most faithfully when allowed to proceed without haste. Books occupied places of quiet honor within many Suffolk County households. Some rested upon carefully crafted shelves in parlors, while others remained close at hand upon writing desks or beside the family hearth, their leather bindings softened by years of respectful use. A well-kept Bible commonly held the place of greatest reverence, not only for its sacred pages, but for the names patiently written within its opening leaves. Births, marriages, and departures from this earthly life were recorded in careful script, preserving the story of a family long after the voices themselves had fallen silent. Beside it might stand collections of sermons, volumes of poetry, atlases, almanacs, works of natural philosophy, and practical manuals that assisted both mariners upon the harbor and craftsmen within their workshops. These books were seldom regarded as ornaments. They were faithful companions, consulted with gratitude and preserved with quiet affection. The county's printers contributed greatly to this enduring habit of reading. Their presses, operated by practiced hands, transformed blank sheets into newspapers, broadsides, church notices, legal announcements, and pamphlets that gradually found their way into homes, schools, counting houses, and libraries. Within the printing office, every letter of movable type demanded careful placement before the great press descended with measured force upon freshly inked pages. Apprentices moved silently between composing cases and drying racks, learning not merely the mechanics of the craft, but the discipline of precision itself. Outside, customers paused to read the latest notices displayed upon the doorway before continuing along streets where the distant harbor breeze turned each hanging sign with gentle persistence. Beyond the schools and printing houses, places devoted to learning assumed many forms. Ministers assembled modest collections of theological works within church studies. Physicians consulted carefully preserved medical volumes before visiting patients. And merchants kept ledgers whose pages reflected years of disciplined record-keeping. Young clerks eager to improve their handwriting and arithmetic, often practiced long after the day's business had concluded, believing that careful scholarship might open opportunities unavailable through strength alone. Even aboard vessels awaiting the tide, navigators studied charts, journals, and celestial tables beneath the glow of lantern light, preparing for voyages that depended as much upon knowledge as upon favorable winds. Thus, throughout Suffolk County, education extended quietly into every occupation, becoming less a separate pursuit than a habit woven gently into the fabric of everyday life. Once, as our quiet journey reached its middle passage, it seemed fitting to pause not beside a monument or within a celebrated hall, but along the familiar edge of the harbor, where so many ordinary lives unfolded without fanfare. Countless footsteps had crossed these wharves, entered these churches, tended these homes, and departed upon these waters, leaving little behind except the gentle impressions preserved within fading records and family memory. Perhaps, for a brief moment, you might quietly consider the place from which you are listening. Every town, village, or distant countryside possesses its own forgotten stories, deserving of patient remembrance. The preservation of local history has never depended solely upon grand institutions. More often, it has rested within families who remembered an old photograph, preserved a weathered Bible, protected a faded letter, or simply spoke the names of those who came before. In such quiet acts of remembrance, the past continued to breathe with unexpected grace. As evening approached once again, Suffolk County settled into its familiar composure. The final pupils departed their classrooms, printers extinguished the lamps beside their presses, and the last readers carefully closed the books that had accompanied them through another peaceful day. Beyond the rooftops, the harbor reflected the mellow light of the descending sun with its customary calm, while church bells drifted softly across the water toward distant neighborhoods already preparing for the evening meal. Nothing within the county sought admiration for its own sake. Instead, its quiet dignity endured through repetition, through lessons patiently taught, pages faithfully preserved, honest work carefully completed, and families gathering beneath roofs that had sheltered generations before them. It was this unassuming constancy that granted Suffolk County its lasting character. The lamps along the waterfront gradually became the brightest lights in the county as twilight surrendered to night. Their warm reflections stretched across the quiet harbor in long, wavering paths that seemed almost to invite another peaceful voyage, though most vessels had already secured their lines until morning. A solitary ferryman examined his boat before fastening the final knot, while nearby, a customs officer completed the last entries within a leather-bound ledger by lantern light. From the upper windows of counting houses, clerks carefully closed heavy account books, whose pages contained the measured record of another day's commerce. Yet beyond those figures lay the quieter story seldom written in any ledger, the patience of the ferryman, the diligence of the clerk, the honesty of the cooper, the watchfulness of the sailor, and the countless ordinary lives whose steady labors had quietly sustained Suffolk County through another passing season. With the coming of another dawn, the markets of Suffolk County awakened quietly, not with hurried confusion, but with the familiar order that generations had carefully maintained. Before the sun had climbed above the rooftops, wagons approached from nearby farms carrying baskets of apples, onions, turnips, cabbages, beans, and herbs, while smaller boats crossed the harbor with fresh fish gathered during the first light of morning. Merchants arranged their goods beneath timber awnings. Scales were balanced with practiced precision, and neighbors greeted one another with the ease of long acquaintance. The marketplace served not merely as a place of exchange, but as one of the county's most enduring meeting grounds, where news traveled gently from family to family long before it reached the printed page. The market square revealed far more than the exchange of goods. It quietly displayed the changing seasons of Suffolk County itself. In early spring, bunches of asparagus, onions, herbs, and tender greens appeared upon sturdy wooden tables. Summer brought baskets filled with berries, cherries, peas, beans, and freshly gathered vegetables whose fragrance mingled pleasantly with the salt air drifting inland from the harbor. Autumn introduced barrels of apples, pumpkins, turnips, squash, and cider, while winter offered carefully stored root vegetables, dried beans, salted meats, and preserved fruits that had been prepared with patient foresight during the warmer months. Every stall reflected the quiet diligence of those who cultivated the surrounding countryside or tended gardens within the town itself, reminding visitors that even a busy harbor depended faithfully upon the steady harvests of the land. Nearby, fishmongers displayed cod, haddock, mackerel, and shellfish brought ashore before sunrise. Their wooden counters rested beneath simple awnings, while barrels of crushed ice, when available during the colder months, or cool shaded storage, helped preserve the morning's catch until eager households selected their provisions. Sailors returning from nearby fishing grounds exchanged courteous greetings, with market women arranging vegetables into neat rows, and children carrying woven baskets accompanied parents through the crowded aisles with quiet curiosity. Above every conversation floated the familiar cries of gulls circling over the harbor, their voices blending naturally with the measured sounds of trade that had echoed across these streets for generations. Many Suffolk County households cultivated small kitchen gardens despite the nearness of the town. Behind brick dwellings and modest wooden homes alike, narrow plots yielded onions, cabbage, beans, medicinal herbs, parsley, sage, and flowering plants whose practical value equaled their beauty. Fruit trees shaded modest yards, where children gathered fallen apples, while older generations carefully pruned branches in preparation for another season. Rain barrels stood beside garden paths. Bees moved patiently among blossoms, and simple wooden fences protected vegetables from wandering livestock. These quiet spaces seldom attracted visitors from beyond the neighborhood, yet they provided fresh provisions, fragrant herbs, and a peaceful retreat from the busier streets beyond. Within the home, meals reflected the same modest abundance found in the market and garden. Fresh bread emerged from brick ovens with its familiar fragrance. Soups simmered steadily above open hearths. Fish from the harbor appeared beside vegetables gathered only hours before. And cider accompanied many ordinary suppers during the autumn months. Families rarely hurried these meals. Conversation unfolded gently between generations, while candles gradually shortened upon the table and the evening light softened beyond the windows. The daily table served not only to nourish the body, but also to preserve the quiet fellowship that remained one of Suffolk County's most enduring traditions. When the evening meal had ended, and the dishes had been carefully returned to their places, many households allowed the remainder of the day to unfold at an even gentler pace. Mothers completed the last stitches upon garments resting in wicker baskets. Fathers examined the tools that would be required with the coming dawn, while children gathered near the hearth to hear familiar passages read from a treasured Bible, a volume of history, or a collection of well-loved verse. The fire cast a soft glow across polished tables and worn floorboards, while outside the wind wandered quietly through the narrow streets before reaching the ever-present harbor. No great event distinguished these peaceful evenings from those that had come before, yet it was within such ordinary hours that affection, memory, and tradition quietly strengthened the life of the county. Families departed to their chambers with unhurried steps, confident that another morning would bring familiar duties, familiar faces, and the comforting rhythm of a place whose identity rested not in spectacle, but in faithful repetition. The harbor itself seemed almost to sleep, though it never ceased its patient movement. Gentle tides continued to lift and lower every anchored vessel with such quiet regularity that even seasoned sailors scarcely noticed the motion. A lighthouse lamp shone steadily across the dark water, guiding late arrivals toward familiar channels, while the silhouettes of church steeples and warehouse roofs stood peacefully against the night sky. Somewhere beyond the wharves, a bell announced another passing hour before its echo gradually disappeared into the calm. These small sounds, repeated night after night, became part of the county's unspoken memory, comforting those who had long called its shores home and reassuring travelers that safe harbor still awaited them. Morning returned with the measured certainty that had long governed Suffolk County. Before the streets grew busy, the doors of many churches already stood open to welcome those who sought a few moments of quiet reflection before beginning the day's work. Sunlight filtered gently through tall windows, falling across polished pews, simple wooden galleries, and well-worn hymnals, whose pages had been turned by generations of familiar hands. The stillness within these meeting houses differed from the silence of the harbor, yet both carried the same enduring quality. Neither hurried those who entered, and both invited thoughtful contemplation. For many families, the church remained not only a place of worship, but also a trusted gathering place where friendships matured, children were baptized, marriages celebrated, and the departed remembered with quiet dignity. Churchyards surrounding these meeting houses possessed a peaceful dignity of their own. Ancient elms cast gentle shade across carefully tended paths, while rows of weathered headstones stood quietly among the grass, their inscriptions softened by many seasons of wind, rain, and winter frost. Families often paused after worship to visit the resting places of parents, children, spouses, or trusted neighbors, brushing away fallen leaves before standing together in thoughtful silence. These modest burial grounds preserved more than individual remembrance. They quietly revealed the continuity of the county itself, where one generation rested beneath the same familiar skies that sheltered the next. Even when names gradually faded from stone, the quiet affection with which descendants remembered them remained an enduring part of Suffolk County's character. Beyond the church grounds, charitable societies and neighborhood associations quietly strengthened the fabric of everyday life. Congregations organized assistance for widows, orphans, the elderly, and families facing hardship, often without public recognition. Women gathered to sew garments for those in need. Ministers carried food and firewood to struggling households during severe winters. And prosperous merchants occasionally provided discreet support for apprentices or children whose education might otherwise have been interrupted. These acts seldom appeared in official histories, yet surviving church records and community accounts suggest that such quiet generosity formed an essential part of the county's daily rhythm. Kindness required neither ceremony nor applause. It simply passed from household to household with the same gentle constancy as the harbor breeze. Throughout the county, memory found quiet guardians within family keepsakes carefully preserved across generations. A pocket watch handed from father to son, a sampler patiently embroidered by a daughter, a sea chest carried home after many voyages, or a carefully folded letter bearing the familiar handwriting of a distant relative, all possessed a value beyond simple appearance. Family Bibles continued to receive new entries written in steady ink, while framed silhouettes, miniature portraits, and carefully stored deeds rested safely within drawers and cupboards. These humble treasures seldom attracted strangers, yet they quietly preserved the story of ordinary households whose lives seldom entered public record. Together they formed a private archive of Suffolk County, carried not within great libraries alone, but within the faithful care of its families. As the day drew toward its peaceful conclusion, the familiar bells of Suffolk County once again carried their measured voices across the rooftops and over the quiet harbor. Their sound reached the crowded streets near the wharves, the brick homes upon Beacon Hill, the modest farmsteads of Noddle's Island, and the narrow lanes where craftsmen were already closing their workshops for the evening. The same harbor breeze that had filled the sails of merchant vessels now carried those gentle notes across calm water, uniting neighborhoods that differed in occupation, yet shared the same enduring landscape. Windows gradually filled with the warm glow of candlelight. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys into the cooling air, and families gathered once more beneath familiar roofs whose quiet comfort had sheltered generations before them. The county asked for no grand remembrance. Its truest legacy rested within these ordinary evenings, where faith, family, honest labor, and the faithful harbor quietly completed another day. The evening deepened until only scattered lanterns remained visible along the waterfront. Their gentle light rested upon the quiet tide, illuminating mooring posts polished smooth by generations of hands, and revealing the graceful outlines of vessels patiently awaiting another dawn. Somewhere within the stillness, the slow footsteps of a night watchman echoed across the cobbles before fading into silence, while from a distant church tower a single bell quietly marked the passing hour. The harbor neither hurried nor lingered. It continued its timeless conversation with the shore, preserving the same calm rhythm that had comforted sailors, merchants, craftsmen, and families throughout the 19th century. Those who paused to listen discovered that Suffolk County spoke most clearly when little else disturbed the night. As the 19th century continued its measured course, Suffolk County revealed that its greatest inheritance rested not in impressive buildings alone, but in the quiet continuity of ordinary lives. Children who had once traced careful letters upon school slates gradually assumed places behind merchants' counters, within craftsmen's workshops, aboard harbor vessels, and around family tables of their own. The familiar streets changed only slowly. Granite replaced timber in certain places. Additional homes appeared where open ground had once remained, and the harbor welcomed new vessels alongside those of older design. Yet, beneath these outward changes, the essential character of the county endured. The harbor still greeted each morning with patient tides. Church bells still gathered neighbors together, and families continued to preserve their memories within well-worn Bibles, carefully folded letters, and stories quietly shared from one generation to the next. Records preserved within Suffolk County quietly reflected this steady passage of generations. Clerks continued to enter births, marriages, deeds, wills, and probate inventories with patient precision, seldom imagining that their careful handwriting would one day become invaluable to descendants seeking the lives of forgotten ancestors. Shelves within courthouse offices gradually filled with bound volumes whose pages carried the names of merchants, mariners, widows, apprentices, craftsmen, ministers, and laborers alike. No single occupation received greater permanence than another. Within those orderly ledgers, every household contributed another thread to the county's enduring story. Surviving county histories and official records suggest that much of what is now understood about 19th century Suffolk County owes its preservation to these quiet habits of faithful record-keeping rather than to grand public ceremonies. Beyond the courthouse, the harbor itself remained another living archive. Weathered granite steps descending toward the tide bore the marks of countless footsteps. Timber wharves, worn smooth by wagons and generations of sailors, quietly preserved the memory of labor that no written document could entirely describe. The scent of salt, tar, seasoned oak, and sea air greeted each arriving vessel just as it had greeted those who entered the harbor decades before. Even when familiar faces gradually disappeared from the waterfront, their daily paths remained visible within the landscape itself. The harbor remembered without words, faithfully reflecting each sunrise and sunset while silently accompanying every generation that called Suffolk County home. Visitors arriving from neighboring counties often remarked upon the distinctive harmony between the busy harbor and the quieter corners of the county. Within only a short walk, one could leave the lively waterfront behind and enter streets shaded by graceful elms, past churches whose bells marked the passing hours, discover modest gardens flourishing behind brick homes, or hear the calm recitation of lessons from an open schoolroom window. This close companionship between maritime enterprise and peaceful domestic life gave Suffolk County a character unlike any inland community. The harbor remained ever present, yet it never entirely overshadowed the homes, workshops, schools, churches, and family tables that quietly sustained the county through every changing season. Throughout these years, ordinary customs endured with remarkable consistency. Families continued to gather each Sabbath. Apprentices learned patiently beneath experienced masters. Ferries crossed familiar waters regardless of changing weather, and neighbors greeted one another along market streets with the ease that only long acquaintance could produce. Such routines seldom attracted the attention of distant observers, yet they became the true measure of the county's permanence. While ships came and departed with every favorable tide, the quiet rhythm of everyday life remained steadfast, allowing descendants generations later to recognize the same enduring spirit preserved within Suffolk County's surviving streets, records, and harbor shores. As our quiet walk through Suffolk County approached its final pages, the familiar harbor appeared once more, unchanged in its patient devotion to the land it embraced. Morning mist still gathered above the water before yielding to gentle sunlight. Church bells continued to drift across the tide. Ferries maintained their measured crossings, and workshops opened their doors to another ordinary day of honest labor. Within brick homes overlooking narrow streets, families prepared simple breakfasts before children departed for school. Craftsmen for their benches, merchants for their counting houses, and mariners for vessels waiting beyond the wharves. None imagined that future generations would look back upon these peaceful routines with such affection. Yet it was precisely these uncelebrated moments that preserved the truest character of the county. The enduring memory of Suffolk County rested not in extraordinary occasions alone, but in the quiet repetition of faithful work, enduring family life, and the ever-present companionship of its harbor, whose calm waters reflected each passing season with unchanging grace. The final evening settled over Suffolk County with the same quiet dignity that had accompanied every chapter of its 19th century story. The last rays of the sun lingered upon the granite faces of Long Wharf, touched the steeples rising above Boston's rooftops, and faded gently across the calm waters that had remained our faithful companion from the beginning of this journey. One by one, lanterns appeared in the windows of family homes, their warm glow answering the first lights aboard anchored vessels. Somewhere a blacksmith closed the heavy door of his forge. Elsewhere, a teacher carefully placed worn primers upon a shelf before extinguishing the classroom lamp. Mothers folded away their sewing. Fathers secured the shutters against the cool evening breeze. And children, wearied by ordinary happiness, surrendered peacefully to sleep. Nothing within the county announced the close of another day with spectacle. Instead, Suffolk County entrusted its memories to quiet routines faithfully repeated, allowing every household, workshop, church, schoolroom, garden, and harbor crossing to become part of an inheritance more enduring than stone alone. There remained at the close of our gentle journey one final walk to be taken beside the quiet harbor that had accompanied us from the opening pages of this history. Morning after morning, and evening after evening, its waters had reflected the changing light with patient constancy, asking no recognition for the faithful service they rendered to every generation. Long before the first shopkeeper lifted a shutter, before the blacksmith awakened his forge, before church bells stirred the sleeping streets, the tide had already begun its silent labor against the granite wharves. It had welcomed fishermen returning with the night's catch, merchant captains preparing for another voyage, ferrymen readying their boats, and laborers whose honest work seldom appeared within official records. The harbor belonged equally to them all, preserving their reflections as gently as it preserved the passing clouds above. Beyond the waterfront, the familiar rhythm of Suffolk County unfolded with the same quiet assurance that had sustained it throughout the 19th century. Brick homes gradually welcomed the day's first light through tall sash windows. Bakers kindled their ovens before sunrise. Apprentices unlocked workshop doors, polished smooth by decades of faithful hands. And teachers arranged well-worn primers upon simple desks before welcoming another class of attentive pupils. Along narrow streets, neighbors exchanged courteous greetings while market wagons rolled steadily toward the town, their wheels sounding softly upon the cobbled ways. None imagined that these ordinary mornings would one day become precious to descendants searching for traces of ancestral lives. Yet it was precisely these unremarkable beginnings that gave the county its enduring soul. The passing years inevitably altered certain familiar scenes. Yet the deeper character of Suffolk County endured with remarkable patience. New buildings gradually appeared beside older ones. Additional wharves extended farther into the harbor, and improved streets welcomed an increasing number of carts and carriages. Even so, the county never surrendered the quiet habits that had shaped its earliest generations. Church registers continued to receive careful entries in steady handwriting. Family Bibles preserved births, marriages, and farewells within their opening pages. Probate inventories patiently recorded the humble possessions of ordinary households, while county histories, period maps, census returns, and surviving newspapers quietly gathered fragments of lives that might otherwise have disappeared from memory. Together, these records formed not merely an archive, but a gentle conversation between generations separated by time alone. Perhaps this has always been the true purpose of remembering a county such as this. It was never simply to preserve boundaries upon a map or to recount notable occasions already well recorded elsewhere. Rather, it was to remember the quieter inheritance left by ordinary people whose names appeared only briefly within surviving documents. The ferrymen who crossed familiar waters before sunrise, the cooper shaping another barrel beside the wharf, the teacher correcting careful handwriting by the light of a tall window, the mother tending herbs within a small garden behind a brick home, the blacksmith whose forge welcomed neighbors through every season, and the child who paused each evening to watch the last sunlight resting upon the harbor together, they formed the enduring character of Suffolk County. Their lives were neither celebrated nor forgotten entirely, for the county itself continued to remember them in every weathered stone, every surviving church bell, every aging wharf, and every faithful tide that quietly return to the shore. If these peaceful evenings, spent wandering through the forgotten counties of 19th century America, have brought a welcome measure of quiet reflection, we warmly invite you to subscribe to the American Gazetteer. Each new chapter gently opens another landscape of rivers, harbors, villages, forests, farms, and communities whose ordinary lives deserve to be remembered with patience and care. We hope these calm journeys will continue to accompany your evenings, preserving the quiet histories that too often fade unnoticed beneath the passage of time. As the final light withdrew beyond the quiet harbor, the lanterns along the waterfront gradually disappeared, one by one, until only the gentle rhythm of the tide remained. Church bells rested until another dawn. Workshops stood silent after a day of honest labor, and the streets that had welcomed merchants, mariners, teachers, craftsmen, and families throughout the day surrendered peacefully to the night. The harbor continued its timeless conversation with the shore, just as it had for generations, reflecting stars where it had reflected morning sails only hours before. Though centuries have now passed, its quiet waters still seem to carry the memory of those ordinary lives, whose faithful work shaped the county far more deeply than any monument alone could ever reveal. We thank you for spending this peaceful evening with the American Gazetteer. When this chapter gently fades into memory, we invite you to continue your journey by watching more county histories and forgotten American stories waiting elsewhere in our growing collection, where another quiet landscape patiently awaits the turning of the next page. And thus, we close the entry for Suffolk County, Massachusetts. Rest well.